Okay. So as I said, the plan for today is to talk about seasonal management from the day you pick up your bees through the entire calendar year, just to give you a very, very general idea of what the season is going to look like. So I'm going to start with picking up your nuke before you even get it to the bee yard, because there are some really important things to consider. One, the time of day when you pick it up. I recommend either picking it up in the early morning or after sundown. And a lot of this is going to have to do with keeping the nuke cool. When you're ready to pick up your nuke, you tell the beekeeper you're coming. If you get it first thing in the morning before the sun is ablazing, this would be a good time because the bees haven't started flying, and the beekeeper probably, if he's paying attention, is going to close them up the night before so you don't lose any forager bees. If you go after sundown, all the bees will be back in the box, and you can close the box up and take it home again, not in the heat of the day. If you go and pick it up in the middle of the afternoon, you'll have a bunch of the forager bees that are out flying. So you can get the box, but you're not going to get the maximum number of bees that you would otherwise if you get them early in the morning or after sundown. Once you pick up your box, go directly home. The bees are going to get extremely warm in that box. And if you take any unnecessary detours, or if they're sitting in the sun too long in the middle of the day, you're going to cook them. And you might get home with a box of dead bees and wonder what happened. Make a plan to get your bees, go directly to where you're going to leave them, and do your best to keep them cool. If you have a long drive, if you're not too squeamish about it, put them in the car and have the air conditioner blazing. You don't want these bees to overheat. Don't pick up your bees, decide that you need 5 things at Walmart, and then you need to have lunch, and then you want to stop off at grandma's on the way home, and 3 other errands en route to home. That is a recipe for disaster. So pick up your bees, drive immediately to where you're going to go, and keep that nuke as cool as you can, and then put them where you want them to be. So I assume you're going to have your hive already set up. You have your spot. Put the bees on that spot and open the door so that they can fly freely. Now, anytime I transport a nuke, sometimes I listen and it sounds like a little racehorse or a little race car in there. I have very, very cranky bees that are very eager to get out because they've been cooped up and bounced around and taken out of their own natural circumstances. They're not going to be in a particularly pleasant mood when you get them to their final destination. So put them there. You might, if this is your first experience with bees, want to put your little suit on, or at least a veil, and then open the door and let them fly. That will let them get out of the box, that will cool the hive, and it will let them calm down for a while. Now you can put them immediately into your larger equipment, but it's not a bad idea to let them simmer down for a couple of hours, or the next day when all the bees are out foraging again. Might be a good time to put them in 10 frame equipment or your 8 frame, whatever you choose to use. Come back later to put them in the larger equipment. But again, don't wait too long. If you get a good strong nuke around the middle of April, this thing should be bubbling over with bees. You should have frames of solid capped brood in there, and that brood should be about ready to emerge. If you decide that you're going to put it in your little nuke box and get to it in a week or two, the population is going to explode in there, and they could possibly swarm on you. And that's something you don't want to happen. So by the time you pick these things up, they're going to be ready to be transferred into larger equipment. Don't do it immediately upon arrival, but again, in the next day or so is probably a good time to put them in the large equipment. When you put the frames in the box, please put them in the order they appear in your nuke box. That way, all of the comb is lined up and you're not going to risk pinching any bees or smashing them. So put them in the middle of the box, put foundation around them, and start feeding them. You've got them in place. Put sugar water in until they stop taking it. Probably be a couple of weeks, because these early hives need sugar and sugar water to inspire them to draw more wax comb so that they can build out their colony. So what you see on this chart here, and this comes from the Mississippi State Extension Office, this is a little chart for feeding bees. And basically at this time of year, in the spring, when you want to feed your bees, you're going to do 1 part of sugar to 1 part of water. And that's done by weight. So for every gallon of water, water weighs 8 pounds per gallon. You want to put about 8 pounds of sugar in. If it's 8.2 to 7.9, the world will not stop spinning. If you kind of get in the rough ballpark idea of a 1-to-1 ratio, that's ideal for this time of year. Please use just white sugar, table sugar, just regular sucrose. Don't use any brown sugar, don't use any powdered sugar, don't use anything but just regular old white sugar. You can mix it on the stove, but don't get it to the point of boiling. If you start getting sugar water too hot, you're going to create a chemical, hydroxymethylfurfural, that's going to be dangerous to bees. So just get the water warm enough so that the sugar can be stirred in, and that is perfect feeding. Now, how you feed the bees is up to you. If you would like to put a frame feeder within the hive, that's one option. Some feeders sit on top of the hive, that also works. What I do not recommend is one of the entrance feeders, one of those little things that you slide in with a mason jar at the very front of the hive. In a time when there's not a lot of sugar to be foraged, entrance feeders might attract larger hives that will rob your nuke, and that's not something that you want. So one efficient way of feeding is taking like a quart jar or a half a gallon jar, poking little holes in the lid like of a mason jar, turning it upside down and putting it through a little hole in your top cover, basically like little hamster style feeding. That is a very good way to do for 1 or 2 hives if you're putting that in the top cover, not at the entrance, because that gives access to other hives that you don't want to be in your way. This chart is handy also because it tells you at various times a year how to feed. If you start to feed in the fall, you're going to want a different ratio that's a little heavier in sugar, and we'll talk more about that a little later. But for now, when you get these nukes home, a 1-to-1 sugar to water ratio is what you're looking for. Now that you've got them in the box, now that you've got feed on them, leave them alone, which is not the instinct of the new beekeeper who wants to see what's going in there all the time. So I say leave them alone, but I put a little asterisk by it. Don't leave them alone for 6 months, but give them a week or so to start building up. This is why sometimes it's advantageous to have multiple hives. You can have one hive that you leave alone a little more and one that you kill with kindness. This is one of the balancing acts of being a new beekeeper. You want to visit them often enough so you can see how they're developing and in what rate, but doing that is likely to, not help the bees, but it helps you. So basically, don't go in there any more than you have to. Once you have them in the box, once you have food on them, I would say don't come back for another week. And now I say understand the 3 pillars of beekeeping. And there aren't really 3 pillars of beekeeping. I totally made that up, but it makes sense to me and it's good to remember anyway. 3 pillars of beekeeping in my imagination are queen management, space management, and pest and disease management. These are the 3 things that you want to think about every time you pop open a hive. When you open a hive, you should always have a reason. Why am I here? If you don't have a really compelling reason to go into a hive, then you probably shouldn't be there. But when you do go in, here's what you want to look for. You want to make sure that you've got a queen in good shape. You want to make sure that they've got enough space to do their thing. And you want to make sure that the hive looks fairly healthy. So you want to devise a plan for your hive inspection. You go up to the hive, you put a little smoke in the front entrance, you put a little smoke under the top cover, and you're going in. Well, what do you do when you get in there? First thing you want to do with all hives is check for evidence of a strong queen. And these are some of the ideas that I mentioned in our first class and Greg mentioned last week, but all of this stuff bears repeating because it's really fundamental to what we do here. So one bit of evidence of a strong queen is finding bee eggs. If you don't see Her Majesty personally, you can see her calling card. If you look at the very bottom of a cell and see one egg, it looks like a little grain of rice standing up in the bottom of every cell, you know that came from a queen. So that looks like a queen who's doing what she's supposed to because every cell has one single egg in the middle. That's good news. For your first inspection, if you go in and you pull out a frame of eggs and you see that there are eggs there, you're pretty much done for until next week. By and large, if they've got a queen and they're doing their thing, you don't have any more to look at. You can also see larvae in there. This is after 3 days of being an egg, the egg hatches and you see these larvae. They look like little worms. Make sure that is nice and pearly white. Pearly white larva is very healthy. You'll see it, all that swimming in a little bed of bee food, and that's all good news. If you see that, you know you're in good shape. 9 days after the queen lays an egg, that larva will be capped. And right in the center of the hive, you see capped brood. Now, this is a really nice frame because most of those little cells are full of bees. There's a little bee under every one of them. You see a couple black spots in there that are cells that were either missed or the larva died and needed to be removed or something went wrong. But by and large, you have more hits than misses. Notice the white stuff on the frame around it. That is honey. So that is the food that they're going to need on the outside of the frame where the brood is built right in the middle. If you see a pattern that looks like that, that is much less desirable. Notice there are more misses than there are hits. So the queen is probably either failing or there's something not right about this hive. It's maybe not a hopeless situation yet, but that would be one that you would want to monitor and make sure that going forward that conditions get a little better, or you might have to put a new queen in there. This is a frame of pollen. So all of the yellow stuff in the various colors in the middle, that's going to be a pollen. That's what they're going to need to raise their brood. Right outside the ring of pollen, you have nectar, and the white stuff on top of the frame is honey, capped honey. So these are all things that you might see when you poke your head into a hive. When you see a frame like this, chances are very good that the queen will not be on that frame. Queens don't like to be on frames that have lots of honey and nectar. So you're going to notice when the colonies start building out their hives, that the outer frames tend to have honey and nectar, and the brood chamber tends to be in the center. Why that is important is that when you go in the hive, you want to do your best not to kill a queen. One way of doing that is taking out the frames on the very edges. If you can take out the frames either against the wall or the next one in, if you imagine 10 frames, either frame 2 or 9 might be a good one to take out first, because chances are the queen is less likely to be there. If you take out that single frame, it gives you a little bit more maneuverability within the hive rather than diving straight into the center of the brood box where you might do more damage. So you know that you've got a good queen, or that's at least what you want to check. You also want to check the colony growth. How many frames of bees in there? How many frames of comb are in there? And you want to add boxes as necessary. I think a general rule of thumb is when you have about, I would say 7 or 8 frames of drawn comb, new wax built on the foundation, that is the time to add the new box. So you put another brood chamber on top of that. Now, when I do that, I will often take some open brood, so some of the larvae, and move it up into the second box. That encourages the bees to start moving up there. The nurse bees don't like to leave their babies unattended. So if you move up some larvae to the second box, it makes the bees aware that that box is there, and they'll start drawing it out a little faster. So when you've got about 2/3 of the box or so filled with drawn comb, you add a second box. And you repeat that process as necessary. When the second brood chamber is about 2/3 full, you put on your honey super. When that's about 2/3 full, you keep doing that until you run out of honey flow, and it's time to kind of cut back. When you go in the hive, check the overall look, sound, and smell of the hive. Look at the hive. Does it look like anything is going wrong? Do the bees look ill? If you have a infestation of varroa mites, sometimes you can see evidence of diseases where the bees will have little deformed wings. The varroa mite that we'll talk more about next week brings a lot of viruses into the hive that could leave your bees in a bad place. So do you see anything that looks like, a sick bee? Do you see any brood that is not pearly white? Does it look brown or deformed, or do you have a lot of casualties? These are things you want to be aware of. If none of that, then move on. Check the sound of your hive. If hives are queenless, sometimes the hives will get what they call the queenless roar, and they'll sound like a little engine starting to rev because they're freaked out because mama is no longer with them. So sometimes you can hear queenlessness. If a hive sounds especially noisy, take that into account and figure out maybe why. If you go in there and there is still a queen, then maybe something else bothered them. Maybe there was a skunk coming by at night or some pest through the night that has them stirred up that would make them sound that way. But use your senses to determine what is natural and what is unnatural. All right. Okay, I've got a question. Make sure that when moving brood to the second box that you position it above the lower brood frames. Yes. So yeah, when you take the brood out, move it directly above the other frames that you have in the hive so that there's kind of a straight up little column that you are building. That'll keep the bees all in one place. And if it gets too cool through the night, they can form a little cluster around their brood. So check the smell of your hive. Normal beehives smell actually quite pleasant, with one exception, and that's in the fall. When the goldenrod starts to flow in the fall, goldenrod pollen is really stinky. If you go out about October and your hive smells like gym socks or something putrid, that's actually a good sign at that time of year. Smelly socks coming out of a hive, that's a sign that they're bringing a lot of pollen from goldenrod. If you smell that at other times of year, maybe there's bad news. Certain diseases have kind of off smell, what we call foul brood. We'll talk more about that maybe next week. But just while you're in there, make sure that nothing is really off as you go through your boxes. Good records. Greg talked about this last week, and it's really important. Some people have these systems that are really too smart for me, where if a brick is facing north or, standing in a certain direction, it means one thing. I don't have that kind of memory to sort that out. I actually take a pen and paper in the bee yard and I write things down. The advantage of doing it old school is you don't have to get honey and propolis all over your iPhone. So I don't expect anyone to keep records quite this sophisticated, but this is an example of what I do here. I just put my name or the name of the yard, the date, and I number all of my hives, come up with some numbering system. And I just give myself little clues, like the first hive I had high hopes for last year in April, well, it swarmed. So I just made a note, check in 2 weeks to make sure that the queen came back and is doing her thing. I had another hive that was queenless, so I put a little star there saying Note to self, go get a queen for this hive to try to save it. The hive number 3, I have QR, okay. Queen right, okay. 5 was queenless. 1 hive was very strong. Hive 11, I say, like, bring another super next time. This one swarm, this one has cap cells. So whatever is going on in the hive that might require attention, just keep a little note here. I might say, okay, this hive should have a queen in 10 days, come back then. Or I need queens for all of these boxes. So this is nothing particularly sophisticated. This is something that is, by many sane standards, completely illegible to everybody but me, but it gives me some kind of clue when I get home and I can't remember all of my hives, what was going on where. So when I come back with queen cells, I can say, okay, I need to put a queen in hives 1, 2, 5, 12, and 24. So whatever system you come up with for yourself, write it down, and it will save you a lot of time later on when you're trying to figure out what comes next. Now, all of your beekeeping activities are going to be dependent on the population of the hive. And the population of the hive is dependent on the flower development, the nectar flow at various times a year. So this chart here I ripped off of Jeff Harris in one of his MSU extension publications. And it's a chart that shows the number of bees in a hive on the left side. You can see that represented by the red line. And on the bottom, you see the month of the year and when the flowers are most blooming. So our honey flow around this part of the world begins about the middle of April in earnest, when you start seeing privet hedge coming out. Notice in anticipation of this, the colonies get really populous. So by the end of May and June, you're going to have close to 50,000 bees in the hive that had 10,000 when you picked it up. So it's really exciting to watch them grow. When the flowers start going away by the middle of July, when the honey flow is over, you notice the population goes down precipitously, because they don't need to keep making bees, because there's nothing for those bees to do in terms of foraging. So when there are a lot of flowers, the queen is laying strong. When there's less nectar coming into the hive, she cuts way back on population. So understanding the population of the hive is going to give you some idea of what you need to do next. Notice, by the way, in September and October, there's a secondary mini flow where you get some, most importantly, goldenrod coming out. And that is enough to, in a good year, give hives the honey they need to get through the winter. So into the summer, once you start establishing your hive, once you're adding the boxes, so we're talking now by the end of June and into July, determine if you have enough resources to harvest honey. I hear people say all the time, oh, in your first year, you should never harvest honey because the world will stop spinning. And my point to you is, if you have surplus honey, take it. You've earned it by this point. You put a lot of sweat into that hard-earned honey. So take it and put it on your biscuits and live a happy life. So if you have 2 strong brood boxes and a full honey super above it and maybe some honey above that, take what's in the super and enjoy it, because they have enough resources down below to keep themselves sustained into the fall and winter. After harvesting, let the bees clean up the supers. Now, next week, we'll talk about getting the honey out of the supers and what to do with all of the wax. But once you have the honey out of the wax, put the box back on the hive for a day or 2, and the bees will take all of that sticky, messy gooiness. They'll lick it all clean, and it'll be bone dry, and then you can take it back to your home. Then you have to store the comb to avoid wax moths. Wax moths are these horrible little parasites that will lay waste to your beeswax. Bad news. I wish I could tell you that I only knew this anecdotally, but I've had hives taken over by wax moths, and it is pure beekeeper error every time I do it, as much as I hate to admit it. So when you bring the clean wax back home after you've extracted, I recommend, if you can, if you have freezer space, wrapping this thing in plastic and putting it in the freezer for about 2 or 3 days. It should be at least below freezing for about 24 to 48 hours. That will kill all the little parasites, all the little eggs, if there's any wax moth larvae or any hive beetles in there, that will kill it, and then you can store this comb. I recommend storing it with moth crystals, not moth balls, but moth crystals. You can put the box in a plastic bag, put a little dish of moth crystals on top of it, seal up the bag, and you should be good to go to save your comb for next year, because this wax is like gold to a beekeeper. It takes about the resources of about 25 pounds of honey to draw wax in your honey super. So if they, just by making the wax for your super, means that's 25 pounds of honey you're not getting. Next year, when it's time to harvest, you put your wax comb on it. They don't have to rebuild it. They can just worry about filling it. You get a whole lot more honey the second year if you treat your wax well. Immediately after pulling honey, treat for varroa mites with Apivar. And again, all philosophies aside, like Greg said last year, this is how I do it. This is not what you have to do. But I strongly recommend that you do something about varroa mites in July. And we'll talk more about that next week. But remember that chart I showed you about population. The population is really high with the bees in July, and then it falls off precipitously because the queen doesn't need that many bees. Well, the population of bees falls off, but the population of mites does not. So the percentage of mites in the hives goes up astronomically in summer. And if you don't treat them or make sure that they're under control, your bees may not see the end of winter. At this point, leave the bees alone again. And this time I mean it for real. Once you pulled your honey, once you put your Apivar in there, go away for 6 weeks. There's nothing you can do for your bees at this point, because they're home and there's not much to forage. Because they're not working hard, they're going to be cranky and probably far less pleasant than they were just weeks earlier, because they have nothing to work on. If you go in there, you run the risk of inviting robbing. If you open up the hive and there's this whiff of honey in the air, all of these other hives that think, boy, I wish I had some honey, are going to think, well, the neighbor has some, let's eat it. And if you're spilling sugar water anywhere or honey, you invite the chance of robbing, which is really bad news and very difficult to stop. So you've treated for the summer, you've taken 6 weeks off. Now we're into about August. This is when the hives are going to start producing their winter bees. And winter bees are actually biologically different from summer bees. They have different chemical components that allow them to live for 6 months as opposed to 6 weeks. So hives have to be strong and building up a good population so they get through the winter, starting in August and September. At this time of year, if the queens are pretty weak or the colonies are weak or they seem to be limping along, this is a good time to either put a new queen in there, or if the hive just doesn't seem like it's going to make it, it's a good time to combine weak colonies. A lot of beekeepers say that you should take your losses in the fall rather than try to get them through to spring. A way to combine the colonies is you take the bees in the weak colony, you put a sheet of newspaper over a strong colony, you put the bees on top of it, and then poke a few holes in the newspaper. And by the time the bees chew through the newspaper, the pheromone of the queen in the main hive will permeate through so that everybody thinks that that's mom and they won't try to kill her. If you want to look this up, look up newspaper combine, and that'll tell you more details on this. But take your losses in the fall so that you can make the strongest hives possible going into the winter. Again, check your food stores. If hives seem a little light, then you want to feed more sugar water. This time you want to have more sugar than water, basically a 2-to-1 formula. So this is 2 parts table sugar to 1 part water if the hives are a little light. And one thing you can do is just kind of lift the back of them. And if they seem really heavy, you're good. If they seem really light, then it's time to feed, feed, feed. If you put Apivar in July, as you were hoping to kill the mites, 42 days later, take the little strips out of the hives for optimal results. At this point, you can hope for a good goldenrod flow. This is when your hives will get all stinky and smell like gym socks, and you know that they're putting in lots of honey that's going to sustain them through the winter. It is not recommended that you take goldenrod honey for yourself because this is what they need. And at this point, you do not have honey supers on the hive. At this point, you raise them in either 2 deep brood boxes or 3 medium brood boxes as you choose. But at this point, you do not put honey supers on because you want the top box full of honey so that they can have food for the winter. Going into winter, you also want to put the honey in the very center of the top box because in the winter, when it gets cold, they're going to cluster at the bottom and they don't hibernate. They actually keep the hive warm by vibrating their little wing muscles, process called thermogenesis, where they create heat by kinetic energy, vibrating wing muscles to keep themselves warm. The problem is they all have to be tightly packed together for this to happen. If there is honey just out of their reach and it's too cold to get it, they can die 2 inches away from a whole frame of honey, and there's nothing you can do about it because they can't break that cluster to actually get to it. So the best chance of feeding them is to put that honey directly in the center of the hive so that they can get to it. At this point in the fall, in about October, you want to reduce the entrances and install mouse guards. Mouse guards are just these little screens like so. This is a fancy one they'll sell you for too much money at Man Lake, but you can also use just some kind of mesh screen that the bees can get through that will keep the mice from taking up residence there in the winter. As we get into winter now, as we're getting into November and December and January, again, you want to be really aware of the food stores. If these colonies are light, you need to feed them. And I would say feed them that sugar water really heavily into about November. At a certain point, though, you want to switch from wet food, if they're still in desperate measures, to either dry sugar on top or candy boards. And you can find recipes online for candy boards that give them emergency food when their honey and sugar water stores are light. If you wait too much into November, you run the risk of introducing moisture into the hive. And I've heard it said that bees can be either cold or wet, but they can't be both. If you have cold bees, they can warm themselves. If you have wet bees, they can dry themselves. But if they're cold and wet, chances are they're going to die. So in the wintertime, they're making this cluster and creating a lot of heat. It's going to create a lot of condensation in the hive that's going to drip down on them. And sometimes that is really hard on them. You don't want to exacerbate the problem by putting a lot of humidity into the hive with sugar water. So as you get into winter, dry food is probably better than wet. As you get into winter, check Varroa levels, which is something, by the way, you should probably, if you're doing it responsibly, be doing monthly. We'll talk more about that next week, and treat if necessary. If you're beyond a certain threshold, again, come back next week for more information on that. But probably plan a treatment in late December with oxalic acid. Avoid frequent inspections in cold weather. Uh, Energy is tight in the wintertime. You don't want to waste their energy by giving them an Arctic blast just because you're curious. If you don't have a reason to be in there to help them, uh, don't go in there. If it's below 55 degrees, just stay out. The queen's going to begin laying around the end of December, usually around the equinox or the first of the year. She's going to start picking up production as the days start to get lighter. That's one of the early triggers that's going to get her to start rearing brood. At this point, you're going to want to start checking the position of the bees in the hive as you get into January and February. So what they do is in the wintertime, they start off in the bottom box and the little cluster is there, and they start chewing their way through the food, moving upward, upward, upward. By January into February, if they're light on food, the bees might be almost to the lid of the hive. And that's going to be one of the triggers that's going to cause swarming in the spring. Swarming is in part brought on by a sense of being crowded or having a very tight population. So if that's the case, what you might want to do is if the cluster is entirely in the top box, getting close to the lid, you can switch the boxes, put the cluster on the bottom and put then the other box on top of them, just so they have the feeling that they have more space coming into the spring. And that's how, in part, how you'll practice swarm prevention coming into the spring, making sure they have enough room to do their thing. By this time of year, the beginning to middle of March, you're going to want to make your splits, you're going to make your increases, and splitting hives around this time of year opens up more space in the brood nest. Because one of the triggers of swarming is overcrowding, one of the ways of preventing that is taking out a bunch of the bees. So you take out frames of brood, you open it up, you give them the impression that it's not crowded here after all, and you hope for the best and hope that they don't swarm. Left unsplit, if you leave them entirely to their own devices, about 87% of the hives will swarm naturally. It is the strong reproductive instinct to do so. Even if you do everything right and do your splits and do just textbook perfect management, you're going to lose 20% of them anyway, because the instinct is just unstoppable in about 20% of the hives. But if you make it to mid-March and you get some splits, you might be able to overcome some winter losses. And at that point, you can congratulate yourself on a job well done because you've survived your first year with bees. And in a nutshell, that is the year in beekeeping. So I'm going to stop sharing now and turn it over to you. I know that went very quickly and I apologize for that, but I hope it gives you some thumbnail sketch of what you're in for the next year, and realize that it's not all that terrible. And if you're a sane person, unlike Greg and me and Jim, and have too many hives, this is not going to eat up a lot of your life. They need a little attention when they need it, but having one or two hives is not a particularly great investment of time at first. So having said that, questions from anyone? Greg, Jim, did I leave anything out?
I have a question, Ed.
Yes, ma'am.
So, since the baby making stops kind of in July, so you're saying that basically at that point your inspections kind of, well, I know you kind of leave them alone for 6 weeks, but I guess my question is at that point you're not expecting as much brood and cap cells and all that kind of stuff that you would see in, say, the spring.
Yeah, the prime swarm season is going to be kind of now till about the beginning of May. So swarming in July is not likely to happen. Swarming occurs typically when resources are in great abundance. So if there's a lot of food coming in, a lot of nectar, a lot of pollen, that's when there's the urge to fly away. By July, resources are scarce. The nutrition that they're getting from the limited pollen they're getting is not very good. So they're kind of eating the junk food at that point, as opposed to the, you know, the broccoli and all the good stuff you're supposed to eat early on. So yeah, you're not going to have to worry too much about swarming at that point, in that part of the year anyway.
No, but Ed, would it be fair to say that if you do see a swarm in like late July, August timeframe, it's probably more of an absconding situation than it is an actual swarm?
Yeah, sometimes, and this is perplexing and depressing all at once for new beekeepers and old alike, when you have a bustling over hive that has zillions of bees in it, and you go out tomorrow and every last one of them is just gone. Not dead, but just not there anymore. That's what we call absconding, and that's when something is afoul. Something has gone wrong. Either they're overrun with mites, that's typically the cause, but something that they don't like about what's going on, and they're just gone, and not a bee is left, and not even a thank you for time served. But yeah, absconding is not swarming. If there's an actual swarm around this time of the year, they'll leave about 40% of the bees and the resources to grow a new queen. The old queen takes 60% of the bees, flies away, and then essentially one colony becomes two. If that happens in July, as Jim said, it's probably a sign of some internal badness that we missed.
I was going to show y'all a cute video. While I was sitting here on the porch, I saw my wife walk out to the shop and go down to our beehives, and she had been wanting me to number the hives because of our inspections. It's easier to keep up with when you have the name or number on all the hives, and I didn't have this spring, and she went out to do it with no hood or veil, and then about 2 minutes later, I saw her trotting very fast back to the shop, flailing away at her hair. So I had to leave to go get beads out of her hair. But for my own personal health and well-being, I elected not to video that and make any comments.
I'm sure she would have enjoyed you sharing that.
Yeah, she would. It was kind of comical, but I also know that I want to have supper in a little while in peace.
Yep.
The second part of that would have been entertaining when you were running away going like this.
Yeah.
Other questions about what we've gone through tonight?
Ed, on you mentioned the jar feeder, the entrance feeders, the Boardman feeders.
Yes.
Now I do have Boardman feeders for my hives, and what I done to try to cut down on robbing when I do get my bees, and tell me if I'm wrong, is you got this when you first bring your nuke in, you're going to have them the very small hole, access hole, entrance hole. I cut my entrance reducer off on the very opposite end to put my entrance feeder there, so that the entrance is on the other side of the hive, so there's more guard bees there to kind of cut down on robbing. Am I doing that correctly?
That's what I would do if I had an entrance feeder. I mean, I think the more you can keep them away, the better it's going to be.
I figured if it's right there by the entrance, then the robbers have a better chance of getting in there and getting it. So
yeah, and just be careful when you go to turn it upside down that you don't spill a lot of sugar water outside the hive. If you only have a couple of hives in the yard, it's probably not a crisis if they're all about the same size. This becomes more of a problem if you have a yard that has more hives in it, and you might have some full-size hive next to maybe a little nuke that where it's sort of a David and Goliath situation.
okay, yeah, I just wanted to make sure I was thinking on the right track. Since I was going to use the entrance feeders, that would be the better way to go.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the best way to do it if you're going to use them.
Ronnie, another way to use that same type jar with the holes in the lid set up is
yes.
A lot of beekeepers will take the top board. I say top board, the
Inner
the
board.
yeah, and not the inner liner board, but the actual top of the hive, and cut a hole in it and set that feeder on that hole,
Right.
and then just make a plug to go back in that hole when they're not doing it. And
Okay,
that way it's up on the top and to the back.
okay. Now, see, I
I
didn't go
haven't done
with,
that, seen that
I-
done.
I didn't go with the telescopic lids with their inner cover. I went with the straight up migratory lids. Would that
Yeah,
still work?
migratory lid, if you can take and cut a hole in the back of it with a hole saw or jigsaw. I've never tried it, but I know others that have. Ed, did you have anything like that or Greg?
I did, and it's very convenient. And if it's close to the house, you can watch it from the porch and see if it's time to refill.
How quick would they go through one of those little? I mean, those little entrance meters are what, a pint or maybe a quart?
Or
Faster than you think. They're little piggies. I mean, they will drink and drink and drink. So yeah, a decent sized hive will go through a quart in a day or two.
Okay. That's kind of what I was concerned with, because I know I'm supposed to pick up my nukes at the end of the month, but at the same time on the first, I'm supposed to go to Arkansas for a week. And I told the wife, I said, I don't think I can leave them for a week because I got to feed them.
Well, I mean, it's not, if you were to go away for a few days or a week, as long as there's food in there. I mean, remember too, that when you get a nuke, there should be stores already in there. You should
Correct.
have a frame of honey or at least a frame of nectar that if they don't get food on them in the day or so, it shouldn't be a crisis.
Okay, because I'd sure hate to go spend $300 on 2 nukes and come home and not have anything alive.
Oh, no doubt. No, it's not going to happen that fast.
Okay.
And realize too that you're probably going to get them around the first or second week of April. By the middle of the month, when you start seeing privet hedge come out, that is the sign of the nectar flow or the honey flow. And they're going to be making real progress getting all of that. And in fact, they may stop taking your food. You may see them draining a jar every couple of days, but the minute they find something better somewhere else, they're going to just neglect your stuff.
Okay.
And this is, I mean, again, getting opinions from beekeepers, generally you get what you pay for when you solicit their opinions, mine included. But a lot of beekeepers will tell you, oh, you should feed your bees. It makes them lazy. I can tell you that I wish I were as lazy as a bee. I would be ruling the world by now. Not feeding your bees will make them dead, which is worse than being lazy. Not feeding hungry bees when they don't have food is kind of like walking past a crying infant and handing them a job application. And it's not what they need at the time. If you have an animal that doesn't have food, then teaching them a lesson by not giving them food is likely to yield bad results. So if they're hungry, feed them. And when they don't need it, they'll stop taking it. So
Good deal.
what else? So quiet tonight. One of the things when you're doing inspections, if you have a bunch of different hives, or either on pallets or some sort of organization to them, try to work every hive in the same kind of order. I mean, the older I get, the mind is just becoming a sieve in a very unfortunate kind of way. So I'll get in the middle of something, I'll start working the hive and putting queen cells in and decide, wait, did I do that hive again? So I have some of my hives on 4-way pallets. So I know as I face the yard, I'm going to start on the one facing me on the left side and work clockwise. So I know if I start there, then I know where I have to go next. And that's just a system that I've created because if the phone rings or something else distracts me, I know where I'm currently standing and where my system takes me next. So whatever you can do to kind of get into a regular routine to mitigate senior moments, I encourage them. Most of you don't know what I'm talking about, but you'll get there someday. What else can we do?
So I have a couple questions about hive placement. So is 2 to 3 feet apart about, I know, Ed, I was thinking back to where we came out to your yard and looked, is 2 to 3 feet apart okay? Is that enough?
Yep.
Okay. And also I've read that it helps the bees to orient the hive slightly differently. So it's less likely for a bee to go in the wrong hive or whatever. Do y'all agree with that? Have y'all had, because currently my stands are both angled like directly the same way toward the southeast. Should I, kind of call one a little bit differently, or have y'all seen that that's an issue?
There are different philosophies on it. Some people say, oh no, it has to be southeast because that they get the best, most sunlight and it starts working them faster. And put them where it's practical, they'll figure it out. A lot of times if you see people have their hives in a single straight row, maybe on a little platform, and they're like 10 hives lined up inches apart from one another. There's a chance that when the bees come in and they've kind of got their little path to the hive, that the wind blows them and suddenly they end up in this hive or the other ones. So they've done studies where you see that the hives in the middle have fewer bees and the ones on the end get the drift of the others. So one way of dealing with that is kind of facing them kind of in opposite directions so that you have one facing this way and one facing the opposite direction. But for 2 hives spaced 3 or 4 feet apart, I don't think you have anything to worry about. I put them 2 or 3 feet apart because I can stand between them on the side and work comfortably without knocking one over. So that's purely convenience for me, but the bees are going to figure these things out. The only thing I would say is don't put them in a place that's going to be sitting water or has potential to be in a flood zone when you least expect it, or a place that might be kind of at the bottom of the hill that's going to hold a lot of fog and moisture. But aside from that, don't put them in the middle of a pine forest. But other than that, the bees are going to be fine.
And I agree, Ed. A lot of mine are lined up on the 4x4. I've got 4 or 5 hives facing the same direction, 3 inches apart, and they do well that way. But I do have some of them separated, like you say. A lot of times, if I need to separate them, that way I can put the top box between the boxes and not have to put it on the ground or whatever. But I found the bees really don't care. And you can put them side by side facing the same direction. They may be a little drifting, but it'll drift to the right and will to the left. So they pretty much balance themselves out. So that's really not been a big issue to me. But anyway, that's just me.
Ed, you just made a point there, or Greg did, that laying his box lid down on the ground, the telescoping cover, or even the shipping cover. That's a good practice when you take that second top box off to set it down to inspect the bottom box. You don't want to set it on the ground. You want to set it on something or prop it up. Less likely that you will damage your queen or lose the queen that way.
Absolutely. Good advice. And with hive stands too, it always cracks me up when I look through Man Lake's catalog and realize what scams they're running. And they'll sell you an official beekeeper hive stand, and they'll be like the $75 piece of wood where I go and get 2 cinder blocks and set them down and put a hive on top of it, and I've spent $3.16. So just think about what you need. Don't necessarily think that if they're selling it, it has to be something that you need to buy. There are lots of ways to save money, and there are lots of ways to spend it unnecessarily. Ideally, if I have a small yard, I like to put them on cinder blocks like 3 or 4 feet apart. If I have more hives in one place and space is more of an issue, I'll put them on little 4-way pallets. If you put them in a long line or on single pallets, one of the disadvantages of that is that if you start working one hive and banging things around, you're going to create vibrations in all 4 of them. So that by the time you get to number 4, they're not pleased that you're there. They're aware of you and no good is going to come of it. If you work hives individually, there's less chance of kind of banging them around and kind of getting them on high alert.
I was gonna have some,
Oh, Jim? Oh, never mind. Other questions? Amber, I know you can't be done.
I do have one more. I promise it's just one more. So, you were talking earlier about storing your frames in the winter. So I know the freezer thing and all that. I understand all that. And then you said after the freezer, you wrap them in plastic and store them. Is that like a necessary step, or once they're in the freezer, you can just put them up in a cabinet or whatever?
If you have freezer space all winter, leave them there if you don't need the space. It's not going to hurt them at all. The thing is, though, you don't want to take them out of the freezer and just keep them in a plastic bag and not put any of the paramoth in it, the moth crystals, because the wax moths, somehow they're going to find them, and you're going to find a big mess afterwards. Now, with only a couple of supers, you can just keep them in a garbage bag that is well sealed, and maybe go in every month or two and maybe put a couple more moth crystals. When you get more supers, I've gotten to the point where I've gotten a little like mover's dolly from Harbor Freight for like $8. And I'll put a bottom board down. I'll stack about 5 supers, put a little paper plate where I'll put the paramoth on, and then I can stack maybe 4 or 5 more up. I'll put a lid on top of that so that you've got enough of that to kind of penetrates the column. And then I get shrink wrap, and I'll shrink wrap the entire hive so that it kind of keeps everything together. And then I've got this whole thing on wheels so that I can move it around the shed and get to what's behind it. So if you have more things that could get in the way, that's what I do, and I found that to be useful. If you just have, I mean, if you've got 2 hives to start, you might have 4 supers, and that's not going to be a problem to store. But the more equipment you get, the more of a hassle it becomes to move around. Greg, do you have
And
any suggestions?
I agree. Wax moths are a real problem. Today I was going through, I was bringing out my old frames from last year, and they had a stack of 6 10 frame deeps that I had the moth crystals in, but apparently I didn't replace them frequently enough. So I lost that 60 frames of wax, and that's devastating. So yeah, I pulled those out, and they were all full of wax moth, and they had just destroyed the wax and all of those. So like I say, yeah, it's a real problem, and like I say, and you need to be better than I am in monitoring it, because I had the crystals in there, but I guess they had dissipated, and the wax moths took over. So anyway, it's just one of those things you just definitely need to watch out for.
And
So how often should you change the crystals?
You probably need to check them about once a month, because the crystals will dissipate and the fumes go down. You put the crystals on the top, and the fumes will go down. And I'd say probably once a month you need to replenish the moth crystals. So
and the next year, before you put the supers back on the hives the following year, take the crystals off of them about 2 weeks and just let them air out, so that the scent of the crystal kind of dissipates from the comb itself. But again, don't use moth balls. Make the distinction with the crystals there.
and at Man Lake, that's called Paramoth. That's the brand, or what they call it. It is the crystals, but it's Paramoth. And of course, I don't know the scientific name for it, but that's what they sell it.
Yeah, paradichlorobenzene or something, but you can get it at Walmart, I think, for significantly cheaper than you can get it from Man Lake. But order it in advance, because sometimes they just go out of stock for a really long time. So I would say maybe by a couple months before you need it, start seeing if they've got a supply of it. You'll also see in the summer little hive beetles running through your hive. Don't panic too much about those. Some people just get really worried that they're going to kill everything. If you have a strong hive, they'll police the hive beetles. A lot of people say that their hives were killed by wax moths and hive beetles. Those are secondary parasites. They come into a hive that has problems already. So if you see lots of hive beetles and wax moths and you think that that's what killed your hive, you probably weren't checking for mites. But I think another scam are all these little beetle traps where you can put sugar, like oil in there, and the bees are going to glue those things down. And when you try to jerk them up out of there, I just fear that I'm going to pour vegetable oil all over my comb, which doesn't sound like a good idea. So keep your hive strong, keep good queens, keep good population, and they're not going to bother you. So don't worry too much about them. Anything else? Well, I guess that is about all for the evening. So I thank you very much for your time. Next week will be our last talk. We'll talk a little bit about parasites and dealing with varroa and maybe some bee diseases and what to do with the honey. And a couple weeks after that, you'll be ready to get some bees if you don't have them already. So if there are no other questions, I guess I will turn you loose and see you next week.
Very good presentation, Ed. Appreciate it.
Good night, all.